What happens when love becomes a weapon? When desire twists into obsession so potent that it eclipses morality, reason, and empathy? Imagine a mind so consumed by relational fixation that every glance, every word, every silence becomes data to be measured. Every reaction a signal to be controlled. You think you know someone? You think you can read their intentions? But what if the person standing across from you is quietly building a storm behind? A smile, a storm that grows. More precise, more lethal, and more unstoppable with every passing day. In this chapter, we step into the private, violent world of Jodi and Arias, a mind where jealousy is amplified into strategy. Obsession becomes compulsion, and relational intimacy turns into a psychological battlefield. Here, the ordinary human experiences of love, rejection, and heartbreak are transformed into instruments of control and violence. We will see the subtle manipulations, the private calculations, the escalation from flirtation to fixation, and finally, to murder. We will watch the transformation of perceived slights into justification, of desire into domination, of trust into entrapment. And we will understand something terrifying. Relational violence does not announce itself. It simmers quietly, invisibly, in the ordinary, and sometimes, by the time it erupts, the damage is irreversible. This is not just a story of a crime. This is a story of psychology stripped bare of the ways obsession, narcissistic injury, and calculated manipulation intertwine to create lethal outcomes. It is intimate, it is chilling, and it is hypnotic. Listen closely, because by the end, you may begin to question how well you truly know the people around you, and how fragile the line between love and danger can be. It starts with small things. Messages sent too often, calls returned too quickly, compliments that feel flattering, almost excessive. At first, it is easy to dismiss just enthusiasm, just affection. But for someone like Jodi and Arias, these gestures are not casual. They are calculated probes testing boundaries, mapping emotional terrain, and establishing subtle control. Every interaction becomes a puzzle. A smile may conceal scrutiny. A laugh may conceal judgment. Every pause, every hesitation, every word unspoken is catalogued. The mind watches, measures, and anticipates, all in preparation for a larger, invisible design, a design of domination, of relational control, and ultimately, of psychological entrapment. Jealousy in this mind is not a fleeting feeling. It is a lens, a filter that colors every perception. Real slights, imagined slights, or perceived competition, they all feed the same compulsive cycle. The mind transforms them into strategies, constantly seeking to restore perceived imbalance, to punish perceived rejection, to regain dominance in the relationship dynamic. The ordinary heartbreaks of love do not merely wound, they ignite obsession. Manipulation is the language spoken fluently here. Words are measured for effect, for influence, for control. Charm, affection, and remorse are deployed strategically, all designed to shape perception, maintain attachment, and reinforce emotional dependency. This is why relational offenders are terrifyingly effective. They do not simply act impulsively. They act deliberately, methodically, psychologically. The escalation unfolds quietly at first, controlling behaviors, surveillance, emotional coercion, subtle enough to evade detection, but potent enough to assert dominance. Every reaction from the target is interpreted, every refusal is analyzed, Every compliance is rewarded in the internal calculus of obsession. It is a chess game, and the pieces are human emotions, trust, and vulnerability. As obsession grows, moral boundaries erode. Acts that would have been unthinkable become justified within the internal narrative. I must protect the relationship. I must correct the imbalance. I cannot lose control. The mind rationalizes, recalibrates, and prepares for extremes. Intimacy becomes weaponized. Love becomes leverage. The relationship itself becomes the stage upon which dominance is asserted. Trial performance adds yet another layer. The public, the court, the audience, they are all instruments in the manipulation. Empathy is simulated, remorse is staged, and every emotional display is calculated to preserve a constructed identity. For Jodi and Arias, the duality between the hidden compulsion and the public persona illustrates how relational violence can hide behind charm, articulate expression, and apparent normalcy. Listeners are drawn into a tense, cinematic journey, witnessing obsession escalate, trust being weaponized, and the ordinary transformed into the deadly. Every word, every glance, every perceived rejection builds the psychological tension, making the horror of relational violence both intimate and relatable. The stakes for the victim are immediate and palpable, and the pattern of manipulation is impossible to ignore. By the end of this segment, audiences grasp the terrifying subtlety of relational violence, how desire, jealousy, and narcissistic injury intertwine, how ordinary emotions can be twisted into deadly tools, and how someone can orchestrate intimacy to control, coerce, and destroy. Once obsession establishes its foothold, the mind becomes a laboratory of escalating behaviors. Every perceived slight or rejection, no matter how minor, is magnified and dissected. The mind seeks patterns, constructing narratives where the target's actions are coded messages, confirming fears, validating jealousy, or justifying control. It is not just watching, it is interpreting, predicting, and planning. The compulsion to dominate evolves alongside the relationship. What began as emotional surveillance, checking messages, noting schedules, observing interactions, gradually becomes psychological suffocation. The offender experiments with influence, subtle criticism to erode confidence, flattery to reinforce attachment, manipulative disclosures to create dependency. Each interaction reinforces a map of vulnerabilities, emotional weaknesses, and points of leverage. Jealousy is no longer an emotion. It is a strategy. Real, imagined, or fabricated rivalries are tools to manipulate, destabilize, and dominate. The mind shifts seamlessly between affection and intimidation, between charm and veiled threat. Every response is calibrated for maximum effect, every silence a potential weapon. Emotional entanglement is the goal, and obsession is the method. The psychological complexity here is staggering. Narcissistic injury is at the core. Any perceived insult triggers a recalibration of the internal hierarchy. The offender must restore dominance, maintain attachment, and neutralize perceived threats. Logic is subordinated to compulsion. Morality is redefined. Control becomes the measure of self-worth, the axis around which thought revolves. Manipulation extends into the public sphere. The persona presented to family, friends, and colleagues is carefully curated. Charm is deployed with precision, empathy simulated, normalcy maintained. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, obsession intensifies. and every act becomes a calculated move in a private chess game. The disparity between public respectability and private compulsion highlights a chilling duality. The same individual can inspire trust, admiration, even affection, while orchestrating terror in intimate spaces. Escalation is inevitable. The private calculations of jealousy and control evolve into confrontation, threats, and ultimately violence. The mind rehearses outcomes repeatedly, scripting interactions, anticipating resistance, and preparing contingencies. Emotional and relational cues are weaponized. Every word, gesture, and look is a test of power. The desire to dominate becomes indistinguishable from the desire to punish, to control, and eventually to destroy. This is relational violence at its most refined, intimate, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. Victims often fail to perceive the danger until the pattern is deeply entrenched. Even when aware, the emotional bond, trust, or love can obscure judgment, creating paralysis and confusion. The offender exploits this, adjusting behavior, adapting tactics, and ensuring that manipulation continues unchecked. Listeners begin to understand the mechanisms that make relational offenders so difficult to detect. The pattern is subtle: charm and obsession, affection and intimidation, surveillance and manipulation, escalation and concealment. The mind orchestrates these elements in complex, adaptive ways, continuously testing and refining strategies to maintain dominance. Trial narratives further expose the disturbing interplay of narcissism, obsession, and strategic manipulation. The public courtroom becomes another stage for control, where simulation of remorse, emotion, or vulnerability is leveraged for personal advantage. The offender understands human psychology at a fundamental level and uses it with precision, shaping perception, controlling narratives, and managing consequences. The tension escalates as listeners follow the trajectory from fixation to violence. Every step demonstrates the terrifying speed at which obsession transforms from emotional compulsion into lethal action. The process is incremental, almost imperceptible at first, which is precisely why it is so effective. Emotional attachment, desire for control, and calculated manipulation create a psychological trap that entangles both victim and perpetrator. By the end of this segment, audiences gain a comprehensive understanding of relational obsession. They see the mind as an evolving strategic system, capable of turning ordinary human emotions into instruments of domination. They begin to comprehend the precision, patience, and cold intelligence behind actions that, on the surface, may appear impulsive or emotionally driven. Relational violence is not chaotic. It is methodical, not spontaneous. It is deliberate. And once obsession is entrenched, the trajectory toward harm becomes a predictable, almost mechanical path. Listeners are left with a chilling insight. The danger often comes not from the obvious aggressor, but from the person who seems most normal, most relatable, most loving. Intimacy itself is transformed into a weapon. Trust becomes a vulnerability. And the mind that orchestrates it all is frighteningly precise, deeply calculating, and horrifyingly human. By the time obsession reaches its peak, the mind of someone like Jodi, Arias is operating with an intensity that borders on mechanical. Every thought, every emotion, every action is subordinated to a single consuming goal: control. Not affection, not intimacy, not partnership, but dominance. The emotional world is stripped into patterns of reward, punishment, and calculated manipulation. The target's feelings, responses, and vulnerabilities are mapped, studied, and exploited with almost clinical precision. This is a mind that rehearses confrontations, predicts reactions, and envisions every possible outcome. Small gestures, a pause, a look, a tone of voice are read as data. Every interaction is an experiment. The offender observes, adapts, and refines, continuously testing limits, probing weaknesses, and measuring influence. It is obsession rendered a strategy, love transfigured into domination. The escalation becomes inevitable. Initial emotional coercion gives way to threats, verbal attacks, and subtle intimidation. When boundaries are pushed or ignored, punishment follows, not impulsively but with forethought, to correct perceived disobedience and reassert control. Emotional manipulation becomes a precise tool. Guilt is wielded, fear is subtly implanted, and dependence is meticulously reinforced. Every step is a calculation. Every reaction is a variable in a complex psychological equation. Victims often fail to recognize the progression until it is almost too late. The relationship may have begun with charm, affection, or trust. The early phases feel ordinary, familiar, even comforting. Yet the underlying current of control flows beneath, growing stronger, more persistent, and more insidious. By the time awareness dawns, the patterns are deeply entrenched and the psychological entanglement is profound. The mind that orchestrates relational violence is a paradox, capable of empathy and cruelty, charm and manipulation, vulnerability and calculation, sometimes all within the same moment. The duality is essential. Publicly, the offender maintains normalcy, appearing loving, composed, or even remorseful. Privately, the obsession dictates behavior, guiding actions that are cruel, calculated, and ultimately destructive. This duality is what makes detection so difficult and danger so acute. As escalation continues, fantasies evolve. The mind envisions total control, not just over actions, but over thoughts and emotions. Every perceived betrayal is met with intensified planning. Every emotional response becomes a tool to manipulate. Every hesitation, an opportunity to reinforce dependence. Desire is inseparable from compulsion. Love is inseparable from control. The internal narrative justifies extremes, rationalizing aggression as protection, retaliation, or necessary correction. In this psychological theater, the offender continuously evaluates the effectiveness of manipulation. They watch for cracks in compliance, signs of resistance, or emerging awareness. Adjustments are made instantaneously, strategies refined, and contingencies created. The relationship becomes a stage for experimentation, domination, and rehearsal, all masked under the guise of normalcy and affection. Listeners experience the tension in real time. The drama is intimate, cinematic, and immersive. Every interaction, every decision, every escalation is laid bare, allowing the audience to witness obsession in its raw, unfiltered form. The horror is not in grotesque acts alone, but in the methodical, patient, and emotionally intimate construction of control. Trial and post-event narratives reveal the chilling precision of relational obsession. Accounts of interactions, letters, messages, and statements show how the offender curated perception, controlled information, and reinforced attachment. The public, the court, and the media all become unwitting participants in the manipulation, illustrating the depth and reach of strategic obsession. By this stage, the victim's autonomy is nearly extinguished. Emotional dependence, fear, and trust are weaponized with terrifying effectiveness. The mind that orchestrates this does so with clarity, foresight, and a chilling absence of empathy. The relational web becomes a trap, and every step toward liberation is met with psychological resistance or escalation. Listeners come to understand that relational violence is a system, not a series of isolated events. Obsession is the engine, control is the method, and manipulation is the tool. Every action is deliberate, every escalation predictable to the mind driving it, and every outcome, emotional or physical, meticulously calculated. The psychological tension builds as the narrative moves toward the inevitable climax. The trajectory is clear to the mind orchestrating it, even if the target remains unaware. The interplay of desire, control, jealousy, and narcissistic injury escalates toward violence. Each step rationalized, rehearsed, and executed with precision. By the end of this segment, audiences grasp the terrifying elegance of relational obsession, the slow, calculated transformation of love into domination, desire into control, and intimacy into a weapon. They understand that relational violence is rarely chaotic. It is deliberate, methodical, and profoundly disturbing. And most frighteningly, the danger often hides behind smiles, charm, and apparent normalcy, making it almost impossible to detect until the consequences are irreversible. The final stage of relational obsession is the culmination of planning, compulsion, and unchecked desire for control. By now, the mind is a precise instrument of manipulation, a relentless engine calculating every response, every opportunity, every consequence. What began as fascination has grown into domination, and every interaction is measured against the single goal of total control over the target's emotions, thoughts, and ultimately actions. This is where fantasy becomes rehearsal. In the mind of Jodi and Arias, every imagined scenario is dissected. How a confrontation might unfold. Which words will provoke compliance? Which gestures will incite fear or submission? Even potential resistance is accounted for. Every contingency anticipated and countered. Obsession is no longer just emotion. It is strategy, and strategy has become lethal. The psychological landscape is labyrinthine. Emotional entanglement becomes a cage. Every attempt at autonomy by the target is met with intensified manipulation. Guilt, shame, flattery, or veiled threats. Every display of independence is scrutinized, catalogued, and used as justification for further control. The offender's mind operates on dual tracks, one public, one private, ensuring that the calculated persona remains untouchable while the obsession drives action invisibly, imperceptibly, inexorably. Control is reinforced through a blend of affection and intimidation. The emotional seesaw keeps the target destabilized, creating dependency and confusion. Compliments are rewards. Criticism is punishment. Silence is strategic. Attention is selective. Every response is designed to reinforce the offender's dominance, eroding resistance and increasing psychological entrapment. The dynamics of fear, trust, and attachment are weaponized with astonishing precision. The obsession evolves into violence. Physical acts are not impulsive. They are carefully timed, mentally rehearsed, and emotionally rationalized. Each movement, each choice, each escalation is viewed as a calculated step in a broader scheme. Violence is a tool, a means to enforce dominance, to resolve perceived challenges, and to complete the cycle of relational control. It is the endpoint of a meticulously structured psychological trajectory, where emotion, calculation, and compulsion intersect with terrifying clarity. Listeners see the chilling duality between outward normalcy and inward compulsion. Friends, family, and colleagues perceive charm, warmth, and relatability, while the private mind navigates complex, obsessive calculations, measuring compliance and anticipating resistance. This duality underscores a terrifying reality. The most devastating violence often comes from those who appear ordinary, trustworthy, even loving. Normalcy is the perfect disguise. The trial, post-crime investigation, and personal accounts further reveal the depth of calculation. Every interaction becomes evidence of strategy. The careful crafting of image, the manipulation of witnesses, the management of perception, the offender's understanding of human behavior, allows them to maintain control even under scrutiny, demonstrating a psychological acumen that is as disturbing as it is precise. Throughout this segment, listeners experience the intensifying tension as the relationship moves from compulsion to domination to lethal action. The horror is both intimate and systemic. It is intimate because it occurs within the framework of a relationship, exploiting trust and emotional attachment. It is systemic because it follows predictable patterns of obsession, control, and escalation, allowing the audience to see the mechanisms behind relational violence with clarity and inevitability. By the end, audiences understand the terrifying finality of relational obsession, how ordinary emotions, love, desire, jealousy, trust can be weaponized, amplified, and distorted into tools of domination and destruction. They comprehend the precision, patience, and intelligence behind such acts, and the chilling human reality that the line between affection and harm can be almost invisible until it is too late. Relational obsession is a machine operating on emotion, logic, and compulsion. It calculates, adapts, and executes with meticulous precision. And once the machine is in motion, escape is nearly impossible, detection is often delayed, and the consequences can be irreversible. The listener is left with a haunting clarity. The danger is not always obvious. The most violent acts can emerge from intimacy, the closest bonds, and the most seemingly loving individuals. Obsession transforms the familiar into the lethal. Trust becomes vulnerability, and normalcy itself becomes the ultimate disguise for a mind capable of destruction. Understanding this is not just education, it is a chilling lesson in human psychology, in the power of obsession, and in the terrifying subtlety of relational violence. By the time the story concludes, listeners realize that the most dangerous minds may hide behind the most ordinary faces, that love and fixation can converge with devastating precision, and that the line between intimacy and harm can be razor thin, almost imperceptible. All the elements, obsession, jealousy, manipulation, control, compulsion, and escalation, coalesce into a single, horrifyingly human truth. The mind can be both charming and lethal, intimate and destructive, calculated and impulsive all at once. And in the case of someone like Jodi and Arias, that convergence is as fascinating as it is terrifying.